What happens when a late-night host decides to ambush their guest with personal questions they specifically agreed not to ask? You're about to witness one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. Miley Cyrus walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set expecting a typical promotional interview. But what she got instead was a calculated attack on her personal life that left her absolutely furious. Before we dive into this incredible confrontation, make sure you subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts crossing the line with their guests. The atmosphere in the studio that night was already tense. Behind the scenes, Miley's team had been very clear about certain topics being off-limits. Her publicist had spent 20 minutes on the phone with the show's producers, explicitly stating that questions about her recent divorce proceedings were absolutely not to be discussed. The agreement was simple: promote the new album, talk about her upcoming tour, maybe throw in some light-hearted banter about her dogs. That was it. Nothing more, nothing less. Jimmy Kimmel had other plans entirely. As the cameras rolled and the audience settled in, there was a mischievous look in his eyes. The one regular viewers know all too well. The look that says he's about to stir up some serious trouble. Miley walked out looking stunning in a black leather jacket and ripped jeans, waving to the crowd with her signature confident smile. She had no idea what was coming. The interview started innocently enough. Jimmy complimented her new look, made a joke about her constantly changing style, and Miley laughed along genuinely. She seemed relaxed, even playful. As she settled into the guest chair, the audience was eating it up, laughing at her witty responses about her creative process and her love for her fans. Everything seemed perfectly normal for the first few minutes. Then Jimmy started testing the waters. He began with what seemed like harmless questions about her personal growth and maturity. Miley answered thoughtfully, talking about how she had learned to set boundaries and how important it was to protect her mental health. The conversation flowed naturally, and you could see her guard starting to come down slightly. But Jimmy wasn't satisfied with surface-level answers. He kept pushing, asking more probing questions about her relationships and her past. Miley began to shift uncomfortably in her chair, her smile becoming more forced. She tried to redirect the conversation back to her music, mentioning her new single and her excitement for fans to hear it. Jimmy nodded along, but it was clear he wasn't really listening. He was planning his next move. The first red flag came when Jimmy brought up her social media presence. He started reading her recent posts aloud, analyzing them in a way that felt invasive and inappropriate. Miley's expression changed. The playful sparkle in her eyes was replaced by something much more guarded. She politely asked him to move on to other topics, but Jimmy was just getting warmed up. He then made a comment about her having a lot of opinions lately, implying she should stick to making music instead of speaking out on social issues. Miley's jaw tightened. She took a deep breath and responded with remarkable composure, explaining that artists have always used their platforms to speak about things that matter. But you could see the frustration building behind her eyes. Jimmy wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed to be enjoying watching her squirm. He made another jab about celebrities thinking they know everything, and Miley finally snapped back with some bite in her voice. She told him she had every right to use her voice, and maybe he should focus on his own show instead of policing what others say online. The audience began to sense the tension. The laughter turned uneasy. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether this was part of the show or something real. Jimmy, however, seemed to feed off the discomfort. He was like a predator who had caught the scent of blood. Then he went for the kill. Despite the clear agreements made beforehand, despite explicit instructions from her team, Jimmy looked directly at Miley and asked about her divorce. Not with empathy, but with smug satisfaction, knowing he was about to make her deeply uncomfortable on national television. Miley's face went white. For a moment, she was speechless, staring at him in disbelief. The audience fell silent, realizing something had gone very wrong. You could hear a pin drop in the studio as everyone waited to see how she would respond. Jimmy sat there with a self-satisfied smirk, proud of his supposed gotcha moment, completely unaware he had just crossed a line that would change everything. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of what would become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. Miley took a long, deep breath, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and controlled, but there was a dangerous edge to it that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. She looked Jimmy straight in the eye and said, "Are you seriously going to sit there and pretend like we didn't have an entire conversation about what was off-limits tonight?" Her voice was steady, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. The audience was completely silent now. The electricity in the air was palpable. Jimmy tried to play it off with a dismissive laugh, the one he uses when he thinks he can charm his way out of trouble. He shrugged and said, "Come on, Miley, lighten up. It's just a question. Your fans want to know how you're doing." But his casual attitude only made things worse. You could see the anger flash in Miley's eyes as she realized he was trying to gaslight her on live television. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice gaining strength with each word. "No, Jimmy. My fans want to hear my music. They want to know about my creative process and my upcoming projects. They don't need you prying into my personal life when you specifically promised you wouldn't go there." The conviction in her voice was powerful, and some audience members were nodding in agreement. Jimmy clearly hadn't expected this level of pushback. He probably thought she would just answer the question and move on, like so many other celebrities do when they get caught off guard. But Miley wasn't about to be bullied by a late-night host who thought he could manipulate her for ratings. She continued, "You know what this is really about? This is about you thinking you can ambush me because you assume I'll just sit here and take it." The host tried to interrupt, raising his hand dismissively. Miley, hold on," he said, in that condescending tone that made everyone's skin crawl. "I think you're overreacting here. This is late-night television. We ask tough questions. That's what we do." His attempt to minimize her legitimate anger was infuriating to watch. Miley wasn't having it. She straightened in her chair, her posture growing more confrontational. "Tough questions. Is that what you call violating an agreement your producers made with my team? Is that what you call ambushing someone who came here as a favor to promote their work?" Her voice was rising now, the passion and frustration of someone who'd been pushed too far pouring out of her. Jimmy made the mistake of trying to be cute about it. He turned to the audience with a fake, confused look and said, "I guess some people can't handle a little heat in the kitchen." The audience's response was mixed at best, with more people looking uncomfortable than laughing. But that comment was the final straw for Miley. She shot back immediately. "Heat in the kitchen? Are you kidding me right now? This isn't about handling heat. This is about basic respect and professionalism, something you clearly know nothing about." Her words cut through the studio like a knife, and even Jimmy seemed taken aback by the intensity of her response. The tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. Jimmy tried to regain control by changing tactics, attempting to play the victim. "Look, I'm sorry if I offended you, but I'm just doing my job here. Sometimes that means asking questions that might be uncomfortable." His fake apology was transparent, and Miley saw right through it. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that comes from someone who's completely out of patience. Your job? Your job is to entertain people, not to ambush your guests, and then act like they're the problem when they call you out. You know what your real job should be? Learning how to treat people with basic human decency. Jimmy was starting to look genuinely flustered now. His usual smooth-talking charm was cracking under the pressure of someone who refused to be intimidated. He tried to take back control by addressing the audience directly. "Folks, this is live television for you. Sometimes things get a little heated, but that's what makes it interesting, right?" He was desperately trying to frame the confrontation as entertainment rather than the professional disaster it was becoming. But Miley wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. She turned to the audience, speaking directly to them with raw honesty. You know what's really interesting? Watching a grown man try to justify breaking his word because he thought it would make good television. That's the real show here tonight, folks. The audience was completely captivated. This wasn't scripted banter or playful celebrity drama. It was real, raw, and utterly compelling. People were looking back and forth between Miley and Jimmy, trying to process what they were witnessing. Jimmy was clearly losing this battle, and he knew it. He tried one more desperate attempt to regain the upper hand by going on the offensive. You know what, Miley? Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being a public figure. Maybe you need to grow thicker skin if you want to play in this world. His words were cruel and calculated, designed to hurt and humiliate her. But Miley was ready. She stood up from her chair completely now, her full height making her look even more formidable. Thick skin? Let me tell you something about thick skin, Jimmy. I've been in this business since I was a kid. I've dealt with more criticism, more scrutiny, and more people trying to tear me down than you could ever imagine. But what I won't do is sit here and let some talk show host with a massive ego think he can walk all over me just because he has a platform. The studio was electric. This was the kind of television moment people would talk about for years. Jimmy was rattled but growing defensive and mean. Well, maybe if you made better choices in your personal life, people wouldn't have so much to criticize, he snapped. It was a low blow, and everyone in the room knew it. Miley's eyes flashed with pure fire. She took a step closer to his desk, her voice dropping dangerously quiet. Did you just say that to me? Did you really just sit there and judge my personal choices while you hide behind your little desk and your writers and producers? The menace in her voice was palpable, and Jimmy was starting to realize he'd gone too far. But Miley wasn't done. You want to talk about choices, Jimmy? Let's talk about your choice to be a manipulative, unprofessional bully who thinks he can say whatever he wants because he has a television show. Let's talk about your choice to break your word and then act like I'm the problem for calling you out. Her words hit their mark. Jimmy was struggling to respond, and the moment had reached a boiling point. Miley was standing at the edge of his desk now, commanding the entire room. Jimmy shrank back in his chair, realizing he'd picked a fight with someone who wasn't going to back down. But instead of apologizing or trying to de-escalate the situation, he made the worst possible choice. He doubled down on his arrogance. Looking directly at her with a smug expression, he said, "You know what, Miley? This is exactly the kind of dramatic behavior that got you into trouble in the first place." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The audience gasped audibly, and people in the front row physically recoiled from the cruelty of his comment. Even his own band members looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in their seats as they realized their boss had just crossed a line that should never be crossed. Miley went completely still for a moment, her face a mask of controlled fury. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that the entire studio had to strain to hear her. "What did you just say to me?" The question was loaded with danger, and everyone in the room knew that Jimmy had just made a catastrophic mistake. Jimmy, either too stupid or too arrogant to realize the gravity of what he had done, actually repeated himself. I said, "This dramatic behavior is exactly what got you into trouble. Maybe if you learned to control your emotions better, you wouldn't have so many problems in your personal life." His words were like gasoline on a fire, and the explosion that followed was spectacular. Miley's composure finally shattered completely. She slammed her hand down on his desk so hard that his coffee mug jumped, and her voice filled the entire studio. "How dare you? How dare you sit there and psychoanalyze me like you have any idea what I've been through? You don't know me. You don't know my life, and you sure as hell don't get to judge me." The audience was stunned into complete silence. This was not television anymore. This was a real human being defending herself against a bully who had pushed her past her breaking point. Jimmy tried to interrupt, but Miley was not having it. She held up her hand to silence him, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "No, you're going to listen to me now, since you seem to think you know so much about my life. You want to talk about dramatic behavior? Let's talk about a grown man who thinks it's okay to ambush his guests, break his promises, and then attack them personally when they stand up for themselves. That's the real drama here, Jimmy, and it's all coming from you." Jimmy was clearly panicking now. He could see his show spiraling completely out of control and was desperately trying to salvage the situation. "Miley, please, let's just calm down and have a normal conversation," he pleaded, but his voice was shaking and unconvincing. Miley laughed bitterly. "Normal conversation? You think this is normal? You think attacking someone's personal life and then gaslighting them about it is normal? This is not normal, Jimmy. This is you being a terrible host and an even worse human being." Her words were devastating, and you could see Jimmy physically flinch with each accusation. She started pacing now, her energy too intense to contain in one spot. "You know what the really sad part is? I actually used to respect you. I used to think you were one of the good ones in this business. But tonight, you've shown me exactly who you really are. You're just another bully with a platform who thinks he can say whatever he wants because he has power." The studio was completely captivated. This was raw, unfiltered truth being spoken to power, and everyone could feel the weight of the moment. Jimmy tried once more to regain control, his voice getting defensive and nasty again. "Look, if you can't handle being asked questions about your public life, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." That was it. That was the moment that sealed his fate. Miley stopped pacing and turned to face him directly, her voice becoming deadly calm. "You know what, Jimmy? You're absolutely right. I shouldn't be in the public eye. At least, not this part of it. I shouldn't be sitting here letting some pathetic excuse for a host treat me like garbage for his own entertainment." She reached down and unclipped her microphone, the sound echoing through the studio speakers. "I'm done with this interview. I'm done with this show. And I'm done with you." The finality in her voice was unmistakable. This was not a tantrum or a dramatic exit for show. This was a person who had reached their limit and was taking back their power. Jimmy was starting to panic visibly now. He could see his entire show falling apart in real time, scrambling to save face. "Miley, come on. Don't do this. We can work this out. Let's just finish the interview like professionals." But his plea fell on deaf ears. Miley was already walking around the desk, heading toward the exit. She paused just long enough to deliver one final devastating blow. "Professionals? You want to talk about being professional? Professionals keep their word. Professionals treat their guests with respect. Professionals don't ambush people and then act like victims when they get called out. You're not a professional, Jimmy. You're just a bully with a television show." The audience was on the edge of their seats, watching history unfold before their eyes. Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Miley, please, think about what you're doing. This is live television. People are watching." But his words only made things worse. She turned back to face him one final time, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "Good. I hope they are watching. I hope they see exactly what kind of person you really are when the cameras are rolling. Maybe next time you'll think twice before you decide to attack someone just because you think it will make good television." With that, she walked straight toward the exit, her head held high and her dignity intact. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent, so they did both. An awkward mix of scattered applause and stunned silence. Jimmy sat at his desk, his face red with embarrassment and anger, completely at a loss for words. As Miley reached the edge of the stage, she turned back one last time and addressed the audience directly. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm sorry you had to witness this, but sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. I hope you all have a wonderful evening." Her grace under pressure was remarkable, and you could see genuine respect in the faces of the audience members. She disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Jimmy alone at his desk with a studio full of people who had just watched him get completely destroyed by someone who refused to be bullied. The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy struggled to figure out how to salvage what was left of his show. He tried to make a joke about it, but his voice was shaking, and the audience wasn't laughing. The damage was done, and everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Jimmy had picked a fight with the wrong person, and he had lost spectacularly. Miley Cyrus had shown the world what it looks like when someone stands up for themselves with courage, dignity, and unwavering strength. She had turned what was supposed to be her humiliation into Jimmy's complete and utter defeat.